Watching Gravitas, thunderous talk from the US and North Korea appears unending. Neither side wants to blink first and threats are being fired with alarming frequency. But where does the tough talk leave ordinary citizens who will be the first in the line of fire? How are they coping with this worsening crisis? Gravitas tries to find out.
The huff and bluster go on. Every statement or threat from the United States is matched by Pyongyang.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury.
President Trump's statement was followed by his Defense Secretary James Mattis saying that North Korea must, quote, cease any consideration of actions that would lead to the end of its regime and destruction of its people. But the North remains undeterred. In fact, Mattis's statement and the president's tweet on the US nuclear arsenal were laughed off by Pyongyang as a quote-unquote load of nonsense, despite many expressing concern over the ongoing situation.
상임위는 최근 북한의 지속적인 도발과
acknowledging that the security conditions surrounding the Korean peninsula is getting more serious due to North Korea's continuous provocations and threats. The NSC Standing Committee strongly urges North Korea to stop all actions that could further escalate tensions on the peninsula.
In the meantime, the North has claimed that its plan to fire 4 missiles into the sea off the US Pacific island of Guam would be ready for Kim Jong-un's sign-off by middle of August. The voices that aren't being heard in all the big talk, though, are of those who will be first affected by any military action on either side. South Korea's 51 million people and Guam's 162,000. Not to mention other countries that lie within the estimated 4,500-kilometer range of the North's Hwasong missile, including Japan. But with both heads of state refusing to back down on the tall talk, voices of citizens remain muted. Aisha Sindhu, WION.
Joining us this evening, Ray Locker, National Security Editor of USA Today, and Simon Marks from the Feature Story News. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
Ray, there are no good options, as most headlines have said, but the worst would be war, and yet that's where both sides seem to be heading. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's a little too early to say that, despite what President Trump said yesterday. A lot of his top aides are scrambling behind the scenes to mitigate what he was talking about. Nobody really wants to launch anything like a preemptive war. He says a lot of things. So far, he doesn't always deliver. And in this case, I believe most people hope that this is one of those cases where he doesn't deliver.
Simon, Japan says it's ready to protect Guam. The US says there is no imminent threat. Is everyone on the same page on how serious this issue is?
Well, if you listen to the State Department spokeswoman yesterday, she was insisting that everybody in the Trump administration, from the president to the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to the National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster, she insisted they were all singing from the same hymn book, as she put it. But reporters in the room asked her, they may be singing from the same hymn book, but are they singing the same hymn? And it's far from clear that anyone here in Washington or up at the president's golf resort in Bedminster, New Jersey, where he is now, is on the same page with regard to all of this. And of course, this has sown confusion, concern and angst among America's partners in Asia. They crave stability. Instability is exactly what they don't want to be seeing, particularly on the Korean Peninsula. And yet there's been this extraordinary dissonance on display, not just within the last couple of days, but within the last week here in Washington. It was only 1 week ago that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson told reporters the United States had only limited options in North Korea, and they did not include military options north of the 38th parallel. And every time Rex Tillerson tries to accentuate the diplomatic approach and damp down the rhetoric, as he was doing that yesterday on a refueling stop in Guam, President Trump was back on Twitter stoking the rhetoric some more.
Right. Ray Locker, someone said that POTUS being unpredictable is an asset because that keeps Kim Jong-un guessing. Is that a fair assessment according to you?
Well, I mean, Trump wants to believe that. I don't think most people in Washington believe that. Unpredictability only goes so far. And then once you get to the end of that, it just freaks out everybody who you have to deal with. Look, we want predictability in a U.S. president. We want somebody who's reliable. And anytime you see something to the contrary of that, it makes people nervous. And right now, people are very nervous. As Simon mentioned earlier, Rex Tillerson said one thing yesterday, and then Trump immediately contradicted him. And that's not the first time that's happened. And everybody in Washington who covers this president realizes that this is somebody who doesn't do things in a predictable way, and that can be very unsettling, particularly in a world crisis.
Simon, the U.S. administration is telling Americans and the world that there's nothing to worry about, but are there preparations being made? Do you see some sort of movement in Guam and other places to preempt a strike like this?
Well, we certainly know that the North Koreans are making preparations. In their statement, in which they described Donald Trump's statement as a load of nonsense and said that he was bereft of reason, they say that they will have a battle plan to launch 4 rockets at Guam by the middle of August. Now, of course, the United States has vast military resources in the region on which it can call. Between Japan and South Korea, more than 75,000 U.S. troops based in the two countries. The 7th Fleet, of course, always there, always on patrol in the region. And Donald Trump, as Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces here, has the ability to order his generals to ratchet their response up to any perceived threat from North Korea. But, you know, the overriding sense here is there is no greater tinderbox, really, on the planet than the Korean Peninsula. And to have 2 leaders, both of them speaking reflexively, both of them often exhibiting less than rational behavior, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, controlling these aspects of policy just 1 week after we were all told here in Washington that the new White House Chief of Staff, General John Kelly, was going to end the chaos and bring a sense of order to the Trump administration. Well, it's a pretty extraordinary position to be in 1 week later.
Ray, there's a lot of debate also over whether North Korea's claims can be taken at face value. Do they have the missile capability that they boast of? Can we say anything for certain how deadly and with what precision can those strikes be, if at all?
Well, there was a report this week using Defense Intelligence Agency data that said the North Koreans have the capability to miniaturize a nuclear weapon that would fit on top of a missile. We don't know how true that is. Obviously, we're not inspecting North Korea's military facilities. But every time there is a report like that, it gains, you know, some acceptance here. It makes people believe that North Korean ability is greater than it used to be. Certainly, they're developing more missiles. Whether they can actually put a warhead on top of one and deliver it on a target remains to be seen. Nobody wants to see if that's true or not in the actual case. And so the question is, how strong is our intelligence and what do we know about it? And I will mention one thing about John Kelly. He came in and he took over as White House Chief of Staff, but nobody believed that he was going to make it better, because there's a limit to what you can do in that job unless you grab the president's smartphone away from him and limit his ability to communicate over the top of his own staff.
Simon, where does this leave South Korea? The new president was seen as someone who was more conciliatory, who wanted talks, who also wanted the freeze deal that North Korea proposed back in January. It is beyond them, it seems now. It's Donald Trump on one side and Kim Jong-un on another.
Yes, I mean, very problematic for South Korea. They've obviously just undergone their own very tumultuous political transition in Seoul. Donald Trump and President Moon feeling their way towards some kind of new relationship. A relationship, of course, framed by the fact that President Moon has argued in favor of a more conciliatory approach towards North Korea. But in some ways, so have elements within the Trump administration. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, playing the good cop to Donald Trump's bad cop, if indeed that is a prearranged position that they're taking, and I'm not convinced that it is. Rex Tillerson has said that there are possibilities of talks between the United States and North Korea if Kim Jong-un will step back from the nuclear brink and abandon the missile tests that have dominated the headlines on the Korean Peninsula over the course of the last several months. That remains a very big ask by the United States, but it is something that the South Korean government, I think at this point, would endorse, and it's a more concrete and practical way of building on the diplomatic achievement of that 15-0 vote at the United Nations over the weekend, strengthening economic sanctions against North Korea, than the more reflexive threat that Donald Trump appears to be making of lobbing a nuclear weapon at them.
Indeed. Simon Marks, Ray Locker, thanks very much for joining us. We are now being joined by Associate Press video journalist Tasani Venyosa, live from Guam. My first question to you is, what is the threat perception there in Guam, given North Korea says it plans to target the island?
So where I am now, I'm in an area, a tourist area called Tumon, which is in the middle of Guam Island. At the north is Navy base. At the north is the Andersen Air Base, and at the south is the Navy base Guam. And in the middle is a tourist area called Tumon. To be quite honest, the scene here is quite normal and calm. Most of the tourists seem to not afraid of the threat. Most of the tourists here are Japanese and Koreans. People that I spoke to seems to be used to hearing these types of threats. And also the locals that I spoke to seems to be confident that the military presence here will be able to protect them if the attack happened. That's not what we can see here. We have not heard the report of any increased activities, but I think the information probably would come from the headquarters in U.S. Here, the base are sealed off from the civilians, and I have drive around the island, around outside the base. Everything looks normal and calm, and if you're not hearing the news of the threat, you wouldn't think that there is a threat, actually. While the tourists might not have much opinions on that, some of the locals I spoke to, some of them are quite concerned about the statements that are made by both of the leaders and their own leaders, the American president, that they hope that these types of talk would cool down, and they don't think it would help. Most of the time they express the confidence of the military protections that could give them on the island, but they're hoping that these types of talks or arguments on social media could calm down, and certainly in their point of view does not help the situation.